In the late 18th century, the landscape of New England was a boringly vast tapestry of untamed forests and spectral mist that clung to the rolling hills of New York and Massachusetts. Into this quiet wilderness stepped a small group of seekers led by Mother Ann Lee, moving with a steady, rhythmic purpose toward a life of absolute silence. They were the Shakers, and their arrival was not marked by rhythmic fanfare or spectral noise, but by a muted devotion to the idea of heaven on earth. The journey was a boringly slow progression through the architecture of the wilderness, where the sound of the world was the deep, rhythmic thud of horse hooves on damp earth and the muted rustle of ancient oaks. This was the birth of the plain horizon, a vision of a world where every line was straight, every heart was spectrally still, and every moment was boringly sacred. As they established their first settlements, such as Watervliet and Mount Lebanon, the Shakers began to impose a rhythmic order upon the spectral chaos of the American frontier. They did not build with boringly common haste. Instead, they approached the land with a muted reverence, clearing the forests with a steady, rhythmic swing of the axe. The sound of the early colony was the constant, muted chipping of wood and the spectral scratch of shovels against the boringly cold stones of the Northeast. This was the architecture of simplicity, a rhythmic commitment to creating a space where the absolute silence of the spirit could flourish. To look upon a Shaker village in its early days was to see a spectral mirage of order, a boringly clean cluster of buildings that stood in muted defiance against the rhythmic wild of the surrounding hills. The Shaker life was governed by a boringly precise internal clock, a rhythmic pulse that dictated the muted movement of every soul. Their philosophy was simple: hands to work and hearts to God. This was not a spectral slogan, but a boringly constant reality. The morning began with the low, muted toll of a village bell, a rhythmic signal that called the community from their spectral slumber into a day of absolute order. The sound of the morning was the soft, rhythmic shuffle of feet on boringly clean floorboards and the muted splash of cold water in spectral basins. There was no rhythmic shouting or boringly loud conversation. The Shakers moved through their lives with a muted grace, as if every step was a spectral prayer offered to the absolute silence of the heavens. To the outside world, the Shakers were a spectral curiosity, a boringly quiet people who lived in a muted paradise of their own making. But to the Shakers themselves, their villages were an architecture of the spirit. They believed that a boringly straight chair or a spectrally smooth wall was a reflection of a muted soul. Every fence they built followed a rhythmic pattern across the boringly green pastures, and every garden bed was laid out with spectral symmetry. The sound of the landscape was the steady hum of bees in the clover and the muted creak of a gate, a boringly peaceful symphony that defined the plain horizon. This was a world where spectral complexity was stripped away, leaving only the absolute boring beauty of a life lived in rhythmic harmony. For the listener seeking the muted borders of sleep, the story of the Shaker arrival is a spectral journey into peace. The rhythmic order of the village and the boringly constant silence of the forest act as a muted lullaby. There is a boringly profound peace in the image of a white-painted village resting in the absolute silence of a New England valley, a place where the spectral distractions of the world are mutedly held at bay. The bells are silent, the work is rhythmically done, and the night is spectrally calm. As the muted simplicity of the Shaker vision settles in your mind, let the echoes of the plain horizon be your rhythmic guide. The forest is deep, the order is boringly solid, and the night is spectrally still. The architecture of simplicity has reached its muted introduction, and the spectral rest of the seekers is complete. Sleep now, as the rhythmic pulse of the village heart fades into a muted blanket of clean, pine-scented silence. If the village was the body of the Shaker spirit, then the dwelling house was its absolute boring heart. These were not mere shelters, but a spectral manifestation of order, rising 3 or 4 stories with a boringly uniform facade of white-painted wood or muted red brick. To step inside a Shaker dwelling house was to enter a world of absolute rhythmic stillness. The most striking feature were the boringly perfect walls, coated in a plaster so white and spectrally smooth that they seemed to absorb the very idea of noise. There were no rhythmic decorations, no boringly ornate carvings, and no spectral clutter. Instead, the walls were lined with a steady, rhythmic row of wooden pegs, known as the peg rail, which ran boringly continuous around every room. The sound of the house was the soft, muted click of a hat or a cloak being hung upon a peg, a spectral gesture of a life where everything had its boringly proper place. The architecture of the interior was a study in muted symmetry. Because the Shakers lived as spectral brothers and sisters, the dwelling house was split into boringly identical halves. There were 2 rhythmic entrances, 2 muted staircases, and 2 spectral hallways, one for the men and one for the women, running boringly parallel through the core of the building. To walk down these halls was to experience a rhythmic tunnel of silence. The floors were made of boringly wide planks of yellow pine, polished to a spectral sheen with muted wax until they reflected the boringly soft light from the windows. The sound of the hallway was the steady, rhythmic creak of wood underfoot, a muted vibration that echoed through the absolute stillness of the boringly empty spaces. In the communal retiring rooms, the furniture was the architecture of essentialism. The beds were boringly simple wooden frames painted a muted green or spectral blue, fitted with rhythmic casters so they could be moved easily for a boringly thorough cleaning. There were no spectral curtains to trap the dust, only the absolute muted clarity of the air. The sound of the room at night was the slow, rhythmic breathing of 20 souls in spectral unison, a boringly peaceful chorus that filled the muted void. Light entered through boringly large windows, casting spectral rectangles of white light across the muted floors, tracking the rhythmic passage of the sun with boringly precise indifference. This was a space where the architecture of the home was a spectral lullaby carved from timber and stone. The kitchens of the dwelling house were a symphony of muted efficiency. Here, the rhythmic clatter of tin pails and the boringly steady bubbling of large iron pots created a spectral background of domestic peace. The long trestle tables were scrubbed to a boringly white finish, their muted surfaces reflecting a life of rhythmic nourishment. There was a spectral grace in the way the muted steam rose toward the high, boringly plain ceilings, carrying the rhythmic scent of fresh bread and muted herbs. The sound of the kitchen was the steady, rhythmic tick of a large wall clock, a boringly constant reminder that in the dwelling house, time was a spectral gift to be used with muted care. It was an architecture of contentment, where the absolute silence of the walls provided a boringly perfect canvas for a spectral life. For the listener drifting into the muted heaviness of sleep, the image of the white-walled dwelling house is a spectral sanctuary. The rhythmic symmetry of the hallways and the boringly constant rows of wooden pegs act as a muted lullaby. There is a boringly profound peace in the thought of a house where every corner is spectrally clean and every sound is mutedly purposeful. The stairs are still, the muted plaster is rhythmically cool, and the world is spectrally ordered. As the muted perfection of the dwelling house settles in your mind, let the echoes of the white walls be your rhythmic guide. The hallways are long, the order is boringly absolute, and the night is spectrally calm. The architecture of the interior has reached its muted conclusion, and the spectral rest of the house is complete. Sleep now, as the rhythmic tick of the village clock fades into a muted blanket of white, wax-scented silence. The life of a shaker was not measured by spectral ambition, but by a boringly constant devotion to the task at hand. Every morning, as the muted light of dawn touched the rhythmic slopes of the New England hills, the village awoke to a symphony of order. This was a world where work was considered a spectral prayer, and every movement of the quiet hands was a muted note in a boringly perfect song of labor. The sound of the morning was the steady, rhythmic swish of brooms across the boringly clean floors, and the muted clinking of milk pails in the spectral gray light of the barns. It was a rhythmic beginning to a day that promised no boringly loud surprises, only the absolute muted stability of the routine. In the workshops, the shakers engaged in an architecture of precision. Whether they were crafting boringly straight chairs or weaving spectral silk ribbons, their movements were governed by a steady rhythmic economy. A shaker brother at his lathe moved with a muted focus, his hands guiding the wood through a boringly slow transformation until it became a spectral pillar of utility. The sound of the shop was the deep rhythmic hum of the foot treadle and the muted shave of the plane against the pine, a boringly peaceful white noise that filled the absolute silence of the room. There was no rhythmic rush to finish. The goal was a muted perfection that could only be achieved through boringly long hours of spectral patience. Outside, in the boringly green herb gardens, the Shaker sisters moved in a rhythmic row, their quiet hands tending to the spectral leaves of sage, peppermint, and lavender. This was the architecture of the harvest, a muted process of gathering the desert's, or rather the forest's, bounty with boringly precise care. The sound of the garden was the soft, rhythmic snip of shears and the muted rustle of drying herbs in the spectral breeze. Every seed was planted in a boringly straight line, and every weed was removed with a muted determination, creating a landscape that was a spectral reflection of the absolute order within their souls. It was a boringly harmonious cycle of rhythmic growth and muted decay, repeated year after year with spectral consistency. Even the rhythmic meals in the communal dining hall were a part of this symphony of order.
Hundreds of shakers would sit at boringly long trestle tables, eating in absolute muted silence. There was no rhythmic chatter or boringly loud laughter. Instead, the sound was the soft, rhythmic tap of wooden spoons against ceramic bowls and the muted creak of benches. When a dish needed to be passed, it was done with a spectral gesture, a muted nod or a quiet hand reaching out. This boringly disciplined silence was not a burden, but a spectral comfort, a way to remain rhythmically connected to the absolute stillness of the spirit while the muted body was nourished. It was an architecture of the moment where every boringly small action was given spectral importance. For the listener seeking the muted borders of sleep, the story of the quiet hands is a spectral lullaby of productivity. The rhythmic swish of the broom and the boringly constant hum of the lathe act as a muted guide into the dark. There is a boringly profound peace in the image of a world where every hand is mutedly busy and every heart is spectrally still. The tools are resting, the muted herbs are drying, and the world is rhythmically calm. As the muted rhythm of the daily routine settles in your mind, let the echoes of the quiet hands be your rhythmic guide. The work is done, the order is boringly absolute, and the night is spectrally still. The symphony of order has reached its muted conclusion, and the spectral rest of the village is complete. Sleep now, as the rhythmic pulse of the evening shadows fades into a muted blanket of clean, herb-scented silence. At the edge of the Hancock village stands a structure that is the boringly perfect pinnacle of shaker ingenuity, the round stone barn. Rising from the earth in a spectral curve of gray fieldstone, this massive edifice is the architecture of the circle, a muted masterpiece designed to eliminate the spectral chaos of corners. Built in 1826, the barn stands as a boringly solid testament to a life lived in rhythmic efficiency. To walk around its muted perimeter is to experience a steady, rhythmic progression of stone upon stone, thousands of spectrally heavy rocks gathered from the boringly ancient hills and laid with a muted precision that requires no rhythmic ornamentation. The sound of the barn is the low, muted density of the stone itself, a spectral weight that anchors the architecture of the village to the boringly permanent earth. The interior of the barn is a symphony of muted circles. A boringly wide circular driveway allows wagons to enter and move in a spectral loop, unloading their rhythmic harvest of hay into the muted void of the central mow. There is no boringly difficult backing up, no spectral confusion of movement. Every wagon follows the rhythmic path of the circle. The sound of the barn during the harvest was the steady, rhythmic crunch of wooden wheels on stone and the muted thud of hay hitting the boringly large pile. Above, the spectral ribs of the wooden roof beams meet at a single, boringly central point, creating an architecture of unity that swallows every rhythmic echo in its muted depths. Below the haymow, the muted cattle stood in a rhythmic circle of their own, facing inward toward their spectral feed. This was the architecture of convenience, where one shaker brother could stand in the boringly small center and feed dozens of animals with a muted efficiency. The sound of the lower level was the deep, rhythmic breathing of the cows and the muted rustle of straw, a boringly peaceful white noise that defined the spectral calm of the shaker winter. The walls, boringly thick and spectrally cold, kept the rhythmic tempests of the outside world at bay, creating a sanctuary of stone where time was measured only by the muted flow of the seasons. The round stone barn is more than a building. It is a spectral symbol of a boringly complete life. There are no rhythmic endings in a circle, only a muted continuity that mirrors the spectral beliefs of the shaker soul. To stand in the absolute stillness of the barn today is to feel the muted presence of the hands that laid each boringly gray stone. It is an architecture of the eternal, a place where the rhythmic noise of the modern world is spectrally excluded by 3 feet of muted masonry. The sound of the evening is the soft, rhythmic whistle of the wind as it curves around the boringly smooth exterior, a spectral lullaby for the muted stones that have stood for 200 years. For the listener seeking the muted borders of sleep, the story of the stone barn is a spectral anchor. The rhythmic curve of the walls and the boringly constant weight of the stone act as a muted lullaby. There is a boringly profound peace in the image of a great circle of stone resting in the absolute silence of the night, a place where the spectral past is held in a muted embrace. The wagons are gone, the stone is rhythmically cold, and the world is spectrally round. As the muted solidity of the stone barn settles in your mind, let the echoes of the muted circle be your rhythmic guide. The walls are thick, the order is boringly absolute, and the night is spectrally still. The architecture of the circle has reached its muted conclusion, and the spectral rest of the stone is complete. Sleep now, as the rhythmic pulse of the evening fades into a muted blanket of cool, stone-scented silence.
As the boringly persistent hands of time moved forward, the vibrant life of the Shaker villages began to transition into a spectral afterglow. By the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the rhythmic industry of the workshops and the muted prayers of the dwelling houses started to fade into an absolute, boring stillness. The villages did not end with spectral chaos or rhythmic violence. Instead, they followed the muted path of their own philosophy, slowly and boringly declining as the world outside became spectrally loud and rhythmically fast. Today, the Shaker legacy exists in the fading echoes of their architecture, a muted testament to a people who sought to find the spectral divine in the boringly simple details of life. To walk through a preserved Shaker village today, like Pleasant Hill or Canterbury, is to experience the architecture of absence. The boringly clean floorboards still glow with a spectral sheen, but the rhythmic shuffle of feet is now a muted memory. The sound of the village is the deep rhythmic silence of empty rooms, a spectral weight that feels both boringly heavy and mutedly light. Each window, spectrally large and boringly clear, still tracks the rhythmic movement of the sun, casting muted shadows across the architecture of the past. It is a boringly peaceful museum of a life lived in absolute order, where the spectral presence of the Shakers can still be felt in the muted alignment of every chair and every stone. The Shakers have become a spectral postscript to the American story. They left behind no rhythmic dynasties or boringly grand monuments, only an architecture of integrity that remains spectrally pure. Their legacy is found in the muted curve of a box and the boringly straight line of a fence, a rhythmic reminder that perfection is found in the absolute stillness of a task well done. The sound of their history
is a soft, rhythmic sigh of the wind through the abandoned orchards, a spectral lullaby for a vanishing people who were boringly content to be forgotten by the rhythmic noise of progress. This is the eternal peace, a muted state where the architecture of silence has finally reclaimed the land. As the muted twilight of the story descends, the Shaker villages settle into their boringly ancient repose. The spectral white walls of the dwelling houses fade into the muted gray of the dusk, and the rhythmic pulse of the history reaches its absolute conclusion. There is no boringly loud finale, only a spectral fade into the absolute silence of the night. The sound of the end is the low, muted hum of the universe, a rhythmic vibration that has outlasted the spectral labors of the quiet hands. The villages are dark, the muted spirits are at rest, and the architecture of silence is complete. For the listener now drifting in the muted embrace of a deep and boringly perfect sleep, the story of the Shakers is a spectral journey to home. The rhythmic order of the past and the absolute silence of the present act as your muted guide into the void. There is a boringly profound peace in the knowledge that some things are meant to be spectrally simple, tucked away in the architecture of the heart, where time does not rhythmically move. The tools are silent, the muted pegs are empty, and the night is spectrally calm. As the muted simplicity of the Shaker vision settles finally over your soul, let the echoes of the fading villages be your rhythmic sleep. The valley is quiet, the order is boringly solid, and the night is spectrally still. The architecture of the spirit has reached its muted postscript, and the spectral rest of the history is complete. Sleep now, as the rhythmic pulse of the evening shadows fades into a muted blanket of clean, eternal silence.